Welcome back. Now, with the fiscal cliff thought to be only a few weeks away, many are comparing this to the disastrous policies followed in 1937, which led the country back into depression. I'm joined in the studio once again by Frank Hollenbeck to discuss these policies. Dr. Frank, thank you very much for joining me.
Glad to be here.
Now, Frank, let's firstly start out with a quote. This is from Paul Krugman, and it says, "But if those calls are heeded, we'll be repeating the great mistake of 1937, when the Fed and the Roosevelt administration decided that the Great Depression was over, that it was time for the economy to throw away its crutches. Spending was cut back, monetary policy was tightened, and the economy promptly plunged back into the depths." Now, what do you think of this, Dr. Frank? Do you think we will be seeing a repeat of what happened in 1937?
Well, the recession of 1937-38 actually started mid-1937 and it lasted for about a year. It's also known as the Roosevelt recession, and it's a recession within a depression, and it was pretty severe. GDP growth fell 11% and industrial production fell 32%. We have to realize that we had a considerable rebound in 1934, 35 and 36. Average GDP growth was 9%, and we actually had an increase in GDP, real GDP, of 13%, over 13% in 1936. And the unemployment rate fell from over 25% to about 14%, and then shot back up to 19% in 1937. Now, a lot of historians have blamed the fiscal tightening and the increasing of reserve requirements as the cause of the 1937-38 recession. So first is the tightening of fiscal policy. As we can see from this graph, we did cut government expenditures between 1937 and 1938. But government expenditures in 1938 were still much higher than the boom years of 1934 or 1935. We see that the government was able to reduce its deficit, but that was primarily due to an increase in taxes. And even though we did have an increase in taxes, it was a relatively small percentage relative to GDP. It was only 1.5%. So it wasn't really the tightening of fiscal policy that led to the recession of 1937. Now, secondly, we can look at monetary policy. And we have to realize that the period between 1933 and 1938 is a perfect example of what I call the Austrian theory of the business cycle. And according to the Austrian theory of the business cycle, we start out with money being created out of thin air. And that can be due to either the monetary authority, or it can be due to the fractional reserve banking system, or it can be a combination of the two. And this money basically masquerades as savings, and it causes a drop in interest rates, which causes investment to boom. Okay, but since we don't really have an increase in savings, we also have consumption is also booming. So what we have is we have consumption and investment booming, but we only have a limited amount of resources. So we have basically a scramble for these resources, which causes prices to rise, which causes input prices to rise, and then we find that the investments that were undertaken because of lower interest rates can no longer be completed because they're no longer profitable because other input prices have risen, and this leads to the bust. Now, the central bank could continue the boom period by relaxing monetary policy again, but that's just delaying the inevitable bust. In other words, the thing about Austrian business cycle theory is that it's fear the boom, not the bust. The bust is the necessary adjustment that we need to have to clear off the malinvestment made during the boom period. Now, if we look at the 33 to 36 period, we had a situation where the US government set the price of gold at $35 an ounce. And because it set a price of $35 an ounce, which was above its equilibrium price, it ended up with a lot of gold inflows, which the government purchased, and it was equivalent to open market operations. In other words, they were purchasing gold, they were putting money into the system. Okay, so we basically had the monetary authorities increase the money supply over this time period significantly. For example, the money supply increased 46% from 1933 to 1936, and prices increased 31% between 31 and 36. And we got to the point in December of 1936 where the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board became concerned about what was happening to prices and what was happening to monetary policy. And as we can see from this quote, recovery is now underway. But if it were permitted to become a runaway runaway boom, it would be followed by another disastrous crash. Essentially, what the Federal Reserve did is it sterilized the gold inflows. In other words, they didn't allow the gold inflows to influence the money supply, so the money supply growth slowed down. That's probably what caused the recession of 1937, 1938, and it wasn't the increase in reserve requirements, because banks were already holding more reserves than were actually being required. Now, the key conclusion we can draw from this is that the fiscal policy and the change in reserve requirements probably made the situation worse, okay? But the real cause of the 37-38 recession was actually the easy monetary policy that was followed between 1933 and 1936.
But Dr. Frank, only a few months ago you did tell our viewers to stop reading anything about the fiscal cliff because you didn't believe it was actually going to happen. So do you still hold that view now?
Absolutely. I still think the highest probability is that we're going to kick the can down the road, or we get some type of meaningless compromise. If we look at the fiscal cliff, it will require an increase in taxes of $500 billion and a reduction in government spending of $100 billion between January and September of 2013. If we've learned anything from Europe, is that this type of austerity, where we reduce government spending and raise taxes, usually what happens is we don't get that much of a cut in government spending, but we do get an increase in taxes, and it's the increase in taxes that actually drives the economy into a recession. So if we do implement the fiscal cliff, I do expect the U.S. economy to be in a recession. What we really need to do is follow a common sense policy for the future. In other words, we do realize that it's going to be the private sector that drives us out of the difficulty that we're in today. And to do that, we have to reduce the resources that the government is using, put it back in the private sector, and then ensure that money is a stable measure of value so that relative prices can play their significant role of allocating resources where society wants it the most. We need to reduce the role of government. Actually, it's 45% of the economy. It was only 25% of the economy back in the 1950s, and it was below 20% before 1940. At the turn of the century, it was only 7% of the economy. So we need to realize that it's the private sector that's going to lead us to growth, but we have to stop this fear-mongering that if we don't have government spending, if we don't have deficit spending and ultra-easy monetary policy, the world is going to go to hell in a handbasket.
Dr. Frank, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your insights with us once again, and I look forward to hearing if it all comes to fruition in the next few weeks.
We'll find out soon enough.
That's all from me and Dr. Frank in the studio for now, but click back to the Dukascopy website for more interviews and updates.